So, our first live stream. Hello, everyone. So I seem to have the pleasure now to fill 10 minutes with something before we can actually go live and start our presentation about data center SAML versus the Atlassian SAML offering. So bear with me. I hope that some people will join early so we can use this as a little bit of a Q&A or ask me anything, whatever you like. I'd rather talk about answering questions than trying to fill a monologue for the next 10 minutes here, or 9 as it is. I've got Björn with me. You don't see him on camera. He's actually using the live stream, and he's already got a lot of sweat on his head. So it was a bit of a rocky start, just in time, but certainly, as you might imagine, all technology failed 5 minutes before the live stream. It's all fine now. Have we got any participants or questions already by any chance? So guys, if you want to, just raise it. Looks like Björn is reading some comments. We're actually streaming on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. Did I miss anything? We're not streaming on Twitch. I learned that. Twitter as well. So you might not see all of each other's comments. We get them all centralized here, but you obviously only see the ones from your side of the stream. And if you're only interested in the presentation and you're looking at the recording of this live stream, just fast forward down where the timer goes to 0. Where we'll actually start with the real presentation. And now I really hope someone asked a question.
Yeah, we have one question.
Cool. And I don't think I'm going to spend 8 minutes answering one. So guys, if you're there already, then please ask some more. So, are you concerned that Atlassian is Sherlocking your plugin? So you call it a plugin, so you're as old as me probably. You're not calling it an app. I'm not sure what you mean with Sherlocking. I assume you mean what Apple often does with when there's a very successful app and then they include that feature in their operating system and that app is dead. The short answer to your question is no, I'm not concerned that Atlassian is Sherlocking our app. It's been, what now, Björn, 4 years or something like that, that Atlassian came out and included data center SAML in Atlassian Data Center. And they originally gave me 6 months beforehand a call and a heads up, hey, this is going to be included in Data Center. And if I'm honest, that was probably the time when I was a little bit worried, what is that going to mean? But ultimately, to be truthful to you, I think it was a good thing. Yeah, it just highlighted or made it more visible that single sign-on is possible, that it's there, and that it fills, and more people got talking about that requirement. But also the other thing, like Atlassian does with many things, they solve a problem that maybe 60-70% of the users are happy with that, and leave the rest to apps in the ecosystem. So there is, and that's what the presentation is a little bit about later on. There is absolutely a use case for the data center SAML from Atlassian, but it's a relatively basic implementation. So a lot of our enterprise and large enterprise customers, it's just not enough for them. They need a couple of things more. And like I said, I'm going to go into the details later. But especially the enterprise, more complicated setups are the ones where our plugin shines with a lot of the additional features, be it on the security side or just the flexibility, like attribute mapping, transformation, those kind of things, or even simple, I call it simple stuff like synchronizing to something like Azure AD or Okta or OneLogin, which you can't really do with Atlassian out of the box. So it's those features that still drive a lot of customers to us, which ultimately means our business has despite Atlassian including SAML and data center, our business has been growing ever since. So no, I'm not concerned. It certainly means also some of the features that Atlassian added recently, like multiple IDP or just-in-time provisioning, means they extended their use case. But again, if you start looking at the details and at the requirements of a lot of our customers, it means they wouldn't be fulfilled by the Atlassian data center SAML. So it ticks the box for more customers than it has before, but it doesn't solve any of the more complicated use cases. So long-winded answer. I hope you like it. So I'm not concerned at the moment, and it's really fun to still be doing that. Tell me we have more questions, please.
Yes,
Cool.
We have a question from Rana.
Okay, hey Rana. I use UserSync, and it's a fantastic. Thanks. It's a fantastic plugin, but why are the install numbers so low? So guys, looks like we have an interesting audience stacking up the difficult questions at the beginning. Maybe I should answer that at the end of the presentation, because a lot of that is covered in there. But Rana, ultimately, we have a decent amount of customers who start with, or let me go one step back. You have the SAML plugin, which includes the UserSync functionality to synchronize users from different identity providers. And you have UserSync again as a standalone plugin, because you could also combine it just with the Atlassian data center SAML. So use the data center SAML for authentication, and our UserSync to provision users from something like Azure AD, for example. Or even with the Microsoft plugin that's there. So there are use cases outside, or just use UserSync to synchronize against custom data sources, like your own REST service or database, things like that. So there are use cases for UserSync outside of being included in our SAML offering. That's why we released it as a standalone app. And yeah, the install numbers are kind of low. I don't know them top of my head. I think they're probably around 60, between 60 and 100. But what we've learned, and it did surprise me a little bit, but positively, but we actually learned that a decent amount of customers who start off with the UserSync app, once they realize it's actually included in the SAML offering, they decide to spend a little bit more money and go for the combined solution. Because there are some, even though the data center SAML might be enough to tick their box and UserSync would give them provisioning, there are some tiny benefits of having that in the same app and well integrated, like being able to sync a user during the login to always have the freshest information. So ultimately, once customers understand that after using UserSync or evaluating UserSync and talking to us, they very often end up purchasing the SAML plugin after all as a combined solution.
Very nice answer.
Thanks, Björn. I think we've got time for one more question, if there is one.
Yeah, I have one for Javier.
Oh God, Javier. I'm not good pronouncing Spanish. What does the end of yes? What does the end of server mean to your app development? Yeah, difficult question. I mean, we have a lot of customers on server, yeah, and we've seen a lot of them moving to data center over in the last 3-4 months, or extending their server licenses for another 1-2 years to lock in old pricing and to give them things. Bottom line, we're certainly not thrilled about server going away, but it ultimately means that some customers will probably move to cloud, and for us it means we'll lose them at least on the user management side, because that's not possible in cloud. But at the same time, other people are going to data center, which is a more expensive offering. So and so far, I think a large amount of our customers went to data center. that migrated already. So I think bottom line for us, it means we're probably about even on the money side, but then also have probably a little bit less customers on data center with a bit more requirements. And when we started off in 2013 with this plugin, and then I'm going to say hello, we started off with 2013 with this plugin and SAML. I think I would have told you I'm probably running out of ideas in 2 years' time. There's no way I can keep adding features, or we can keep adding features for 5, 6, 7 years. And to be honest, our backlog is bigger than ever. So there's still a lot of demand. There's still a lot of requirements that people want to do with our plugin. And with all the flexibility we have today, that backlog is still quite long. So I think we still got a long time to go. Right, so let's end that hello Q&A session. And I hope we have a couple of viewers now. And let's start with the main event, which is comparing our single sign-on, our SAML single sign-on app versus the Atlassian Data Center built-in single sign-on. And I've got that in sort of 2 parts. I'll start off quickly with a short introduction about resolution, and on a PowerPoint, 5-6 slides. Then I quickly move over to the comparison website that we have and just scroll through that a little bit to show you, because that's a resource you have access to. So talk you through, because you can go and read that later if you like. Talk about a little bit of the differences, and at some of those points I'll actually jump into the product and show that a little bit more in depth. Usually that's the point in the smaller trainings where I say I love interactivity, so ask questions. That's harder on a live stream, obviously, and this is our first live stream, so bear with me if it's not perfect. Nevertheless, ask your questions in chat, and I've got Björn with me, who's sort of doing the production. He's gonna try to sort them, compile them, and then either interrupt me if they fit at a certain stage, or at least at the end he'll gonna put them in as a subtitle so that I can start answering them. And also there's always our support, and you can always book screen shares with us. So if you want any demonstration, or if you want to do a setup together with us, or talk through a bit more of a complicated setup, guys, that's what we're here for. And we do this kind of thing every day. So use that knowledge, use that experience, and reach out to us. Okay, let me share my screen. Actually, it's already sharing. Let me just swap over to the presentation. Maybe I should have introduced myself. I'm Christian Reichert. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of Resolution. The company has actually been around for a fairly long time, since '98. We started off with Cisco routing, switching, firewalls. But since 2013, we're fully dedicated to the Atlassian ecosystem. And 2012, 2013 was when we published our first app to the marketplace, which was the SAML single sign-on app, which truthfully is still the app that pays a lot of the bills. So we have a variety of additional companion apps on the user management side that some of you might know, that complement single sign-on and other use cases with it, which is very successful. And then if you look at the bottom on the embed apps, so that's our first go-to into the cloud space. But that's still early days, growing apps, but still very small compared to where we are with everything on the user management side. We're a gold marketplace vendor, and we're fully dedicated to the Atlassian marketplace. So we're not a solution partner. We're not playing in other ecosystems. That's really our home, and that's where we feel very happy. Our SAML app is the #1 single sign-on app for both server and data center. It's got a bit more than 7,000 installs now, with a bit more than 7 million licensed users. And if you do the math, you can see that we tend to have relatively large licenses, customers, and that comes mainly due to the fact that we can cater for a lot of the enterprise features that are required in more complicated setups. Obviously, our app works very well in simple setups too, and we have many of them, but it's really sort of where you need the flexibility, where we can really shine. And lots of good support reviews, so just read the marketplace page. Or I assume if you joined the stream, many of you will have used our apps already. Actually, saying that, maybe if you like, give us some comments. If you use our app already, what is the thing that you like most about it? That's so that I can read up on that later. It's always nice to feedback. We're also open to some good suggestions. So if there's anything there where we could be doing better, then leave that in a comment too. So, but today, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the feature comparison between our SAML app and the Atlassian Data Center SAML. I'll go a little bit into the theory, do a recap how single sign-on works, and also user synchronization versus just-in-time provisioning. And then we'll swap over to the website in order to look at the bit more the feature comparison, and then once in a while also into the product to show you those. So on a very, very high level, there's a, you see with the green and red bullet points, there's a lot of areas that our plugin can cover where the Atlassian Data Center is certainly not there yet. Some of that is around identity providers in terms of the configuration via metadata, but also automatic reloading, accepting automatic changes. We've got also a variety of additional features when you have to deal with multiple identity providers. Then there's a whole complex of user provisioning and permission management, be it creating users based on the SAML response, what we call just-in-time provisioning. This is also something that Atlassian covers. We give it a bit more flexibility than you have on the Atlassian side, but then there's also something like our user sync functionality, where we really implement different APIs for different identity providers to natively synchronize users into the Atlassian application, automatically deactivating users, attribute mapping, those are kind of things. So there's a real complex of functions that deal with user provisioning. And to be fair, it's interesting to see that very often authentication is actually not the biggest challenge. So just logging the user in is not the biggest challenge when going single sign-on and maybe disconnecting from your LDAP and Active Directory and going to a cloud IDP like Azure or Okta, something like that. Very often the bigger challenge is actually how do you get the user accounts into the Atlassian application in the first place, so the provisioning part. Then there's a level of security features, and with those, interesting enough, it's very often black and white with our enterprise customers. Sometimes, very often, it's their security divisions who require some features like single logout or different encryptions or signed authentication requests, and then there's no, it's black and white. Either you have it or you don't have it, and if you don't have it, you can't, they can't use you. And then the last part is a bit around configuration, customization, troubleshooting. So I think we've been used, or our plugin has been used in very demanding environments and business critical environments for a long time. So we have a lot of troubleshooting and tools like Authentication Trackers, but also possibilities to export the configuration, do adjustments via API, customizing all our page templates, everything that we show to the user, etc. So there's another complex of features where I think there's a lot of flexibility that we can add to your instances. Right, but let's go to the theory first a little bit. I think, and I hope I don't bore anyone with that, but I actually think it's nice to do a little bit of recap how SAML works, so that because that explains some of the limitations or design choices that you have to do when implementing SAML, and explains a little bit some of the direction that we went down, or that Atlassian had to go down as well, and their limitations or benefits. So to be honest, what I'm going to tell you now is probably 90% technically correct. The other 10% really depends on the exact configuration and options and different choices. But at the moment, it's more important for me to get the idea and fundamental workings across, rather than get stuck into technical details of configuration options. So let's assume you go to, I'll take Jira as an example, but when I talk about Jira, I mean all the Atlassian applications. Our plugin is available for all of them. If there's any difference, I'll point them out. So let's say you click a deep link to get to Jira. So hit your Jira link in an email, your browser opens, and you go to Jira and you're not authenticated yet. Usually Jira would show you the password prompt. Our plugin intercepts that, and then in step 2 here, puts a SAML request together, or sometimes called as an authentication request, and then redirects your browser in step 3 to the identity provider via post or redirect, and so that your browser is going to deliver that SAML request to the identity provider in step 4. Yeah. That identity provider looks at the request. If it's encrypted, it decrypts it. If it's signed, it checks the signature. It does a couple of checks until he's happy to take that request. And then it's the job of the identity provider to do the authentication. That can be very simple. So if you've already authenticated against that identity provider before, or because you're logged into your Windows PC and part of the domain, then the identity provider already knows who you are. If not, you would usually see the normal username password prompt from the identity provider. Put in your username password to authenticate, and then at that step, it's also the responsibility of the identity provider to check any policies that might be configured there. Yeah, so policies can be different, or what you can do is a little bit different from identity provider to identity provider. But to give you some examples that are relatively common, like this user can only authenticate with a second factor, and then it's asking for a second factor, or sending you an SMS or an in-app push to do something. Or only allowed to authenticate from certain locations, countries, IP address ranges, from devices with certain certificates, from devices with up-to-date antivirus. Those kind of policies you can configure on the identity provider, and the identity provider at this point makes sure you adhere to all those policies. And once the identity provider is happy, okay, I know who that user is, I can trust him, he adheres to all the policies, then he's going to put together a SAML response. And that SAML response at the minimum needs to contain your username, and that's typically an attribute called name ID. But you can typically configure the identity provider as well to send more attributes. Yeah, and attributes that could be things like your full name, group memberships, email address, manager, office location, usually anything that the identity provider knows about you, you can configure to be sent as an attribute across. So basically step 5, identity provider puts the SAML response together with all the attributes that he's configured for, and then redirects in step 6 your browser back to our plugin to step 7, where we take that SAML response, and then again a little bit this is my warning to take my train soon. So I should have turned that off, but hey. Nevertheless, so step 7, we look at the SAML response, make sure it's properly signed, it's correctly time boxed, etc. has an ID that we haven't seen before. So there's a couple of checks that we do. There's some more depending on the configuration, like decrypting, etc. So once we are happy, we can then create the user session and log the user in. Or if we are also configured to do just-in-time provisioning, that's essentially creating and updating the user based on attributes in that SAML response. Then we also create and update the user before creating the session in step 8. And the final step is to redirect the user's browser back to the page he originally requested. So you end up on the deep link that you clicked a certain issue, for example. So that might sound very complicated, but to be honest, from a user experience, if you haven't seen that before, it's relatively simple and straightforward. So you click that link in your email, or you hit jira.yourcompany.com. You get quickly redirected to the IDP. If you're already authenticated there, get redirected back and see the page that you wanted to have. So that takes 200-300 milliseconds. If you're quick as a user, you see your address bar changing twice, but your experience is click the link, bang, I see the page that I requested. And if you weren't authenticated, you obviously get the password prompt and afterwards get redirected back. So the user experience is very straightforward, and most users will not even realize they just got authenticated and maybe even their user account created. So what are some of the noteworthy things on this? One thing is, if you look at just SAML, everything happened via the user's browser. So for SAML to work, you don't need a direct network connectivity between the identity provider and your Jira. So you might have heard it. So there seems to be a bit of construction work going on in our building. So it started now, perfect timing. So I hope it's not going to be too annoying for you. So nevertheless, you don't need direct network connectivity for SAML as a protocol to work. That also means SAML is a very good protocol for those situations where you don't have network connectivity between your IDP things. So if you move your Jira application to be hosted with a solution partner or in AWS and have your identity provider internally, then that will still work as long as the user's browser has a direct connectivity to both systems. Yeah. Also, the next thing is the user's password is never transmitted across here. Yeah. Here's step 7 and 8 to verify and log a user in. That's done via public-private key cryptography, so that we know we can trust that identity provider and do what he says we should be doing, logging in a user with that username, for example. So the user password is never transmitted to us. So our plugin never knows the user's password, which also means if the plugin creates a user, that user doesn't have a password in the Jira application. Yeah, so that doesn't matter. You can still log in via single sign-on, but that user could not log in with a local password, for example, or use the API with a local password. You need to do an API token for them to be able to use the API, for example. So that's maybe the 2 key takeaways. And it's a little bit of a break going to the next slide when I start talking about provisioning, but I also think it's worth just reiterating a difference between synchronization and what we call just-in-time provisioning. With synchronization, actually Atlassian does some synchronization out of the box via LDAP. So your typical LDAP against Active Directory is a synchronization method to get users into the Atlassian application. But that typically doesn't work with some of the more modern cloud IDPs like Azure AD, like Okta, Ping Identity, Keycloak, for example. And it also, we've seen very many cases where people need to break their LDAP connectivity because they move their Jira to AWS, for example, or to be hosted with someone else, and there won't be a VPN to their internal Active Directory. And that's where SAML can be sensible to provide authentication, but then also our synchronization options or the just-in-time provisioning can help with getting your users into the Atlassian application in the first place. So let's start on the right side with just-in-time provisioning, which is a feature that our SAML single sign-on plugin provides, but also the Atlassian Data Center provides. Here, users and groups are created in the Atlassian application during the first login. Because we use the attributes in the SAML response, and the minimum we then need in the SAML response for just-in-time to work is to have a full name, an email address, and the username. We use that information to create and update the user in the Atlassian application. So that means that user will only exist the first time after he logs in for the first time. Also, if you map users or if you map groups, they always only updated during the next login. So whenever your Jira session has expired and you run through the SAML flow again, that's when any updates to your user will happen. Also, we cannot really delete or deactivate users with this process, because if I jump one step back, this process always only happens on step 7 and 8. But if you deactivate your user in Azure AD, for example, the whole thing stops on step 4. The identity provider tries to authenticate you, sees your user is disabled, and then tells you, hey, this account is disabled, and that's the end of it. So our plugin would never know that this user got disabled. That means if you use just-in-time provisioning, either regardless if that's with our plugin or with the Atlassian Data Center SAML, you still need some way of manually deactivating or process to deactivate users manually, or to have some kind of additional plugin, for example, like our user deactivator, to deactivate users after a certain amount of inactivity so that they don't consume a license and don't pose a security risk. Also, our SAML plugin already comes with a basic implementation for user deactivation. So if your requirements aren't too special, then the SAML plugin our SAML plugin already has everything on board to deal with deactivating users as well. And then maybe one very little note, because Azure AD is probably the or Azure AD and Okta are the most prominent IDPs today for cloud deployments. If you use Azure AD, Azure AD doesn't support sending group names via SAML responses. So if you want to use just-in-time provisioning with Azure AD, then you only get the group IDs. So there's long ID strings in SAML, which doesn't make it very manageable. Yeah. Our attribute transformation with just-in-time has some ways to deal with that. But on the Atlassian side, you'll be stuck with the complex group IDs. So that's not a really nice scenario, but that's a bit of a speciality on Azure AD. Synchronization is slightly different. Obviously, users are created. Synchronization means we run a sync on a schedule, typically something like, for example, once an hour. So users and groups are generally created shortly after you created them on the IDP, whenever the next sync runs. Changes and updates are replicated during the next sync, but that also means we can deactivate or even delete users if that's wanted once we see they are no longer present or have been deactivated on the identity provider. And it also means all users and groups, if you don't filter anything out in the configuration, will get synchronized regardless if that user has logged in already or not. So the user is present as soon as he's on the IDP. And typically, maybe one step back again, User sync, we've only implemented the APIs for the most common identity providers. So today we have Azure AD, we have Okta, we have Google G Suite or Google Cloud Identity, how it's now called. We've got OneLogin, we've got Keycloak, where we implemented the APIs. We're also, with the next release that we ship next week, we'll also have SCIM included, which is like SAML is for authentication. SCIM is a protocol for provisioning. So we'll be able to connect to all systems that use SCIM. So there's a lot of systems you can already connect to our user sync, probably covering 80–90% of our deployments. And there, for those customers, usually synchronization is the better option to go down. Yeah. Just in time, honestly, is 100% better than having to do everything manually. So in those cases where user sync is not supported on, for that IDP, and you only have SAML and can only rely on the attributes in the SAML response, then just in time is a much better solution than having nothing. But usually synchronization beats them hands down. So that's it for the presentation. I'm just gonna look towards Björn. Do we have any questions so far?
You answered one question already a little bit, the SCIM question.
Okay. Good. Then let's move over to our comparison website. So we've actually went through and have a little bit of a side-by-side comparison to the Atlassian data center SAML on our website, and Björn is gonna put the link into the comments later on at some point. I'll talk you through that a little bit, and then in some important instances, I'll swap over into the product and show you things directly in a running system. So first of all, it's about how easy is it to set up. I think we have a relatively clever setup wizard that has a lot of pre-configuration done for a lot of the IDPs as well, and we have step-by-step guides for those identity providers, as well as tutorial videos, and with a lot of the UI changes recently. I'm at the moment re-recording most of them, so I get a lot of camera time now. And on the Atlassian side, it's more cut and paste, so there's no real guided installation. It sounds maybe much more of an advantage than it is, because the Atlassian configuration is still somewhat simple because it doesn't have a lot of features. So if you know where to cut and paste what, it's just a couple of fields. But obviously our site has a lot more features, and that's where the wizard really helps you to set up the configuration as you need it and configure some of the advanced features along the way as well. So one of the more important things here, you actually see the screenshot from the Atlassian SSO 2.0 where you have to start cut and pasting things. Our plugin can actually provide and load SAML metadata, and SAML metadata is usually a good way to exchange capabilities between the service providers or plugin and the identity provider. So we do provide a metadata. So if you have a IDP that supports reading metadata, you can just get the link from our plugin and load a lot of the metadata easily in there, and vice versa as well. So if the identity provider supports providing metadata, then we can read it. And most modern IDPs do that. So for be it Azure, Okta, ADFS, you name it, it's as simple on our side as putting in the metadata URL, say import And then we can get a lot of the configuration, the signing certificates, encryption certificates, can load all of that via the metadata link. That makes it simple to set up, but it has another advantage. And before we actually had that feature, the number one production issues that we did run into was that single sign-on stopped working when certificates expired. So if the token signing certificate on one of the sites, for example, expired, then single sign-on would fail. And it's maybe a little bit that you know from your HTTPS website. You install the certificate, then you forget to set your reminder for 2 years later to renew it, or the guy who actually installed it has left the company by now, and bang, at some point you can't get to your website again. And it's somewhat similar with SAML. So once the token signing certificate, for example, expired, that's it, no more logins until you exchange it. And usually systems like the IDP can deal with it. Yeah, an IDP typically before a certificate expires, he adds a new certificate to his metadata, leaves that on, then he swaps over of using that new certificate, and after a while he removes the old certificate. So that's called a certificate rollover. And with us being able, if you set up our plugin with the metadata link, then by default we actually pull that once a day to make sure to see any changes in that metadata, like those certificate rollovers, so that we can do them automatically. And to be honest, by this alone, the production errors based on that went down by probably 90-95%. So they are usually, we had them flush in at the beginning of the year when ADFS and Azure did a lot of rollovers. But nowadays, we very rarely have that. And it's not a fun experience if you're 10,000 user data center instance and users can't log in for a couple of hours until you figured out the certificate mess. Yeah, and that's the other thing that has changed. When we originally started, we had a lot of setups with ADFS, and single sign-on was a nice to have, yeah, but people still always had to fall back to authenticate with username and password. But nowadays with Okta, with Azure AD, and users not having local passwords anymore in the application, single sign-on really has become something that's business critical, i.e. people cannot log in anymore if that fails. So I think that makes that feature a lot more important than people might realize on the outset. So the other thing down here, we also support, there are two ways defined in the SAML standard, actually three, but the third one no one uses really. Redirect binding and post binding, so delivering the SAML response or request via redirect, HTTP redirect, or HTTP post. Atlassian SAML only supports post. There we support both post and redirect. Most modern IDPs will be fine with just having post, but if you have a maybe more custom IDP, custom developed IDP, an older one, or maybe even just a bit more special one that requires redirect in one direction, we support it in both directions, then our plugin is the only choice you have there. The other thing is single logout. And this is it's a funny feature because it's so black and white and really polarizing across our customer base. What's meant with single logout is if you, for example, if you log out of Jira, that you also get logged out of the IDP and all the other applications that the IDP authenticated you against. Or if you log out from one of the other applications like Salesforce, for example, that Salesforce logs you out of the IDP and all the other applications, including Jira, for example. Yeah, and that's so black and white across our customer base, polarizing. There are customers who absolutely want this, and there are customers who absolutely don't want this. Yeah, I mean, we support both, so you can have a configuration where if you log out, you only log out of Jira, and that's what Atlassian SAML does. But we also support single logout. So if single logout is important to you, then we support it, and we support it in both directions, both initiating a single logout, but also receiving single logout requests if it has been initiated somewhere else. And quite often, so a lot of the arguments from the customers who want this is if my user, if he's on a public PC, logs in and he logs out, I want him to be signed out of all the applications and not having to think of going to 10 different applications to individually log out. And also sometimes just from security policies or frameworks, it's a clear requirement, and then our plugin is the only option that you have to go down. Right, user provisioning. I talked about provisioning already a little bit, and I'm also going to jump because I'm going to combine this with the attribute mapping here. I'm going to jump into our plugin in a second. So essentially, two provisioning methods that we support: just-in-time provisioning. I talked about that. That's also what Atlassian supports, and user sync, so synchronization via the API of Azure, Okta, Google Cloud, etc. That's only what our plugin supports. But there's much more if I go a little bit into the details. So let me jump to Jira. Let's go to user management. Right, so here we've got SAML single sign-on. And let's go into one of the IDP configurations down here. Well, let me just put that into just-in-time provisioning so that I can show you a little bit more. So the first thing that is interesting to know, if you use the Atlassian Data Center SAML, then essentially your usernames need to be exactly the same on both sides, on the identity provider and within the Atlassian application. So on the Atlassian side, you can say, in this attribute is my username, and then that username is being looked up in the Atlassian application. That's it. With our and that's where a lot of enterprise requirements come in, because the world there is, let me call it bluntly, a bit more messy. Yeah, you might have not have had a nice usernaming scheme from the outset, especially if you attach a historically grown Jira instance to an centralized identity provider. Or it's things that you may have to, your identity provider has the full domain name and the username, but you need the whole thing without the domain. So there's a lot of different scenarios where we see usernames not matching on both sides. And that's where we have a lot of features. One thing that we can do, for example, is this find user by this Jira attribute. And that means, let's take the example. The IDP sends c.reichert@resolution.de as the username, which is also my email address. Yeah. And by default, and that's also what the Atlassian plugin does, it then looks, is there a user c.reichert@resolution.de? Yeah. And if it finds that user, logs in. That's what our plugin does as well if you have this set to username. But if you have a historically cloned Jira and your username scheme is all over the place, and sometimes that's not easy to change because you have other connected systems as well which use that same username. What we found most of the time, what's relatively up to date is the user's email address, because they want to get their notifications. So then you could set find this user by this Jira attribute to email address. And what our plugin would do then is it actually looks for the c.reichert@resolution.de, not in the username. It actually looks for the user with the email address c.reichert@resolution.de and then logs in that user. The same thing, some of our largest customers, they have their own globally unique user ID. So they sometimes add a customer authentication attribute, some sort of external ID or global unique ID, so that they can identify that user always by that ID. That ID is then not the user's username, because that would look ugly. But that ID can then be used as the authentication attribute, which also means we can automatically change usernames, all other attributes when they change, because the unique key we look for is then that authentication attribute that we generated. That's, like I said, something our biggest customers do. So it might be 1 in 100 installations who need that. But especially the lookup via the email address, especially when you're moving an instance to single sign-on, that's relatively commonly used. Maybe not always for the forever, but at least for a period of a few months until the user base has been cleaned. And very often our plugins can then actually help with cleaning that by automatically renaming users there as well. So that's one thing which is one of the top used features. The other thing you see down here, which is our attribute mapping, where we can actually say this is the attribute coming from, in this case, Okta, so via SAML, and map that to the following Jira attribute. Yeah, for example, the name ID in SAML, use that as the username. But then you can do a lot of actions with that. Yeah, we have some templates here, like use the name ID, or things like use the name ID but strip the email domain. And for some of the other IDPs, like Azure, we have a lot more, like rename B2B users, so guest users, to something sensible. So there are a couple more templates on other IDPs. But you also have this custom thing. And here you have a lot more control over what you can do. You can, for example, define a list of attributes and use the first non-empty value. Sounds strange, but to give you an example use case, a lot of customers have their IDP connected to their internal Active Directory or synchronized to their internal Active Directory, and have from historic reasons still the Active Directory usernames as or the Active Directory accounts names as the username of the customers for the users. So that might be C. Reichert, for example. Yeah. Now that's fine, but with if that's synchronized to Azure AD, for example, to take a common case, then Azure AD can also send me the C. Reichert in one of the attributes, the on-premise account name, and then I can use this. But any users that are only created on Azure AD, or for example guest users, they will not have that attribute populated. So you either would need to rename all the old users to use something like the Azure UPN, or you're stuck here. You can't use guest user features or anything that people really like about Azure AD. And something simple like define a list of attributes and use the first non-empty, you can do something like, well, if the on-premise account name is there, then use that. If the on-premise account name is not there, then use the Azure UPN to identify that user. You can apply regular expressions, which essentially is a lot of search and replace on steroids, if you know what regular expressions are. But you can even go, you see there are some things like combine multiple attributes and constants into value. But the last thing, and that's a relatively new feature, which is what I find super cool, and our head developer, Jörg, every second word he says nowadays is groovy. So he likes it very well too. Is you can even apply groovy code to this. And just, we have a knowledge base article which gives a couple of examples. And just to give you an example, yeah, we have a customer. he wanted to always log in. If a user is part of the group guest, he always wanted to log in that user with the username guest user. And that's what this does. So if it's part of the group guests, we set the username to guest user. If it's anything else, we use his normal username. Or we have another big customer creating a lot of very nice computer chips. Their IDP sends role information, but in somewhat interesting way. So there are attributes in there like, is this admin? And then the value is yes or no. Is project admin yes or no? That's information you can't really use in Jira sensibly if it's delivered in that way. So they have written set a little bit like this. And then they can say, well, if there's the attribute is sysadmin, and if it's set to yes, then add that user to the group Jira administrators. Yeah, as a project ad, etc. So basically, you can take Groovy to implement a lot of custom logic that you or your customers have that you would never find in a plugin like this because they are very special to the customer situation, but can really easily apply them here. And the last thing I want to show you down here is you can also add new attribute mappings here. So I can have a user property attribute. I could call that manager, for example, go to next, and then say the source attribute is a SAML attribute called manager. And then it would take the SAML attribute manager and put that into a user property manager. And if you're a sysadmin on Jira, you see all those user property fields. So if you go to the user profile, you see those fields. You would see the manager field. Other users, unfortunately, don't see that of each other, but you can still programmatically use that information. And we have a lot of customers who do this kind of mapping to, for example, map cost centers to users, to add manager information, to add location information to those user records. And then if the user, for example, opens a case on Jira Service Desk, they use something like Script Runner or some of the workflow toolbox utilities to copy the field from the user property into the issue field, and maybe even create some logic based on it, like determine who the approver is to send a request for the approver, so that the user's manager is the approver of that Jira Service Desk. Also, in the version coming out next week, we will be supporting Cybermedia's linchpin. So you'll have a additional, not on Jira because linchpin is on Confluence. So you have an additional source here where it says linchpin user value, and then you can actually write and linchpin social profiles. Really gives very rich profiles for users that they can maintain, etc. And so we can hand over stuff that we received from the identity provider, but also via the UserSync API. I'm going to talk about UserSync a little bit later. We can hand that over to linchpin social profiles to fill fields in there. And probably 4 weeks after that, so 6 weeks from now when we record this, we'll also be supporting Comonado's user profiles for Jira and user profiles for Confluence to hand over values to that app as well, which is probably the most commonly used app to extend, especially the Jira user profile. And again, that is something that Atlassian as such doesn't really help. Not going to go into all those settings below and group settings, but you can see there's a lot more flexibility here. You can filter lists of groups. You can determine automatically add people to groups when they get created with just-in-time provisioning. On the Atlassian side, it's much more If you map groups, if you map a group attribute, then that's exactly what you get. All those groups, nothing more, nothing less. You can't filter them, you can't move them, you can't add to them. It's exactly what you get, so there's no flexibility. And I know this may have been confusing, this may have been a little bit much showing you this, so it wasn't really my goal to that you can happily go out and write Groovy code now. It was more important to me that you get an idea of what's possible, or that a lot of things are possible. Yeah. And if there's one thing you take away out of this whole presentation at the end, I would wish it is that you see that our plugin is incredibly powerful and incredibly flexible. So whenever you get into a situation where you have some requirements where you don't see how to meet them, then reach out to us and we'll help you see if our plugin can be a good solution to that. And the example with Groovy code, we don't, I mean, yes, absolutely. If you have Groovy experience and you maybe even deploying our plugin more often, go and write your Groovy code. More than happy to. But our expectation is much more. That's not something you have to do every day. So come to our support with the requirements, and we'll do the Groovy code writing for you. So I talked a bit about mapping and attribute mapping. Like I said, not going to go into advanced group settings. Takeaway hopefully is there's a lot of flexibility there. Also, the same thing is true about redirection. Yeah. What do I mean with that? Basically, if you remember that from the SAML presentation, the SAML flow, we actually need, and the Atlassian is the same, we need to make a decision to which identity provider, or for example, to show the local username password field, where to send the user to before we actually know who the user is. Yeah? That can be super simple if you only have one identity provider and every user needs to go to that identity provider. It can get relatively complicated if you have 10 different identity providers and some users need to go to this and this and this, and some others might even want to still log in with local username and passwords. That's a process we call IDP selection, and I'll talk about that in a minute or so, what we have there. On the Atlassian side, the only control you have is to say, well, SAML is my primary authentication method, and then everyone gets directed to a single identity provider, or you can say it's secondary, and then you get a login prompt with an additional button for the identity provider. And if you have multiple identity providers, that's the only real good choice you have, is have different buttons for the different identity providers. And I'll tell you in a second in the product what options you have with us. But even below that, and that's maybe the screenshot you can see there a little bit, on our side, you can even tune it down to exclude certain URLs from the redirection policies or add some URLs from the redirection policies. You don't have to do that very often. Maybe 1 out of 100 customers needs that, but for them, it can be very important. They sometimes have written their custom plugin which provides some information under a path where that we want to exclude from the redirection, for example. They might have a quirky load balancer who doesn't like redirects, and you want to exclude that user agent string from being redirected so that it can do its health check. There's a quirk with Microsoft Office that it can open 2 tabs if you don't exclude the Microsoft Office query string from that. So if you click a link in Excel, for example, that can open, that either can take a minute or it can open 2 tabs. So there are some quirks which where our default settings are usually fine already, but where that kind of control absolutely helps. Yeah. But let me talk a bit about multiple identity providers. So I'm going to go to redirection here. And this is where you control, yes, redirect everything. And here you can also choose to enable redirect of the customer portal for Jira Service Management. And by the way, that's actually another good example. The Jira Service Management portal is another good example for the advanced redirection controls that we have, where you can define additional URLs. Sometimes you don't want to have every portal go to an identity provider. Yeah. On the Atlassian side, it's all or nothing. Here you can do something like, for example, the URL of the portal service desk /portal/4 to be redirected. And everything else gets the normal username and password prompt, or vice versa. Yeah, exclude the /4 from the redirect, so that people get a local username password prompt when they go to that portal straight away, and all other users get redirected. Just as I just thought of it. But then you have the tab IDP selection, and I made a 10-minute video going into details about what options you have on the IDP selection, but I'm going to give you a quick highlight here as well. Yeah. The first one is, and that's the most commonly used, is the IDP selection page. And that is somewhat similar to the Atlassian approach of showing multiple buttons on the login page. The IDP selection page, let me just save that and show that in a incognito window. The IDP selection page looks a little bit like this. Yeah, you can basically select which identity provider you can log in. If I have descriptions for identity provider, it will also show the descriptions for it. And it will save your choice in a cookie. So once you've chosen Okta, for example, next time you would see this page, it would redirect you to the same choice after 3 seconds as a default. Yeah. That's the IDP selection page. But we also have customers who have actually a lot of IDPs. Some of the universities, like 50 or 100 or even more IDPs. For them, very often the selection method by email address is a good one to choose. And what you can do here is you can essentially map domain parts to different identity providers. Solution D to, again, let's say test.de to Azure AD, and then let's do save. And if I would go to my incognito window again and reload that, you see that page looks slightly different, like enter your email address. And if I would be creichert@resolution.de, it would start redirecting me to one login, for example. Let me close that. So that is a common use for someone who's got many IDPs, or even some customers who don't want to expose the different identity providers they have. So sometimes they don't want to know different contractor companies that they work with each other, have integrated their IDPs, then that by entering their email addresses, they will never know about the other company, for example. But there's even more than that. Let me just go back to selection page, for example. And we can also use HTTP request headers. Yeah? And a lot of the large customers actually have some kind of load balancing, reverse proxy infrastructure that offloads SSL very often. And those infrastructures can sometimes already determine by different aspects of a user. For example, if he comes from a corporate LAN IP address range, what kind of user that is. Yeah, or if he comes from any of the North American connections, he's a North American user. If he comes from any, or if he comes via the North American proxy, he's a North American user. If he comes in via the European proxy, he's a European user, for example, or different VPN address ranges. So sometimes some of those largest customers can already determine by their network infrastructure what kind of user that is. Yeah, some even have a group policy that adds a header to whatever their Internet Explorer or it's using. Some others have their own portal that where you already logged in, and therefore they can add a header to this. So if you have something like this, for example, let's say IDP, and the header value is, for example, IDP1, or let's call it Azure, then we can send the user to Azure AD, and so on. And the cool thing here is, and that really can help a lot, because it can ultimately, with single sign-on, you want to make it as easy as possible and as frictionless as possible for the user. Usually, especially if you have 20, 30, 50,000 users logging in. If they spend 10 seconds each morning selecting the IDP they want to log in with, that's a lot of seconds wasted, yeah, especially if you have that information already. And here, this can really help, that you can determine, okay, if that user comes from this corporate IP address range or via this proxy, we'll send him to Azure. If this user comes from here, we'll send him off to Okta or to ADFS. And the nice thing is, this even combines well. So if that header doesn't match, we can fall back to the IDP selection method here. So if that header is not set or not matched correctly, he will be shown in this example, the IDP selection page. And that's a very common use case. We know if a user comes in via this proxy, he needs to go to there. If he comes in via that proxy, he needs to go there. If he comes in from the internet, he could be a North American user, European users, we just don't know. And then he gets the IDP selection page to choose from, for example. Yeah, so that gives a lot of flexibility and helps on an enterprise level if you have the right infrastructure to make it very easy for your users. And this gets even cooler if you, and I'm jumping ahead of myself now, but yeah, that's my presentation style, sorry about it. That gets even a little bit more cooler if you can combine that with another feature that we have, which is the page templates. Basically, anything that we show to a user is a velocity template. Yeah, you see here the IDP selection template, and here's the velocity template for it. You see the different IDPs, and here's even the small script that looks at if the cookie is set already, and then redirects the user to the IDP after three, or to the previous IDP after 3 seconds. If you don't like that, if you don't want a user to see that page ever again after he made his one selection, just change that in the script to 1 millisecond. Yeah, and if the cookie is set, he gets redirected straight to the choice of IDP he had before. Or if you want, I mean, you've seen our IDP selection page. If you want another example, let's say MongoDB's Jira. Look at this. This is also our IDP selection page. Yeah, the guys from MongoDB did a really great job in modifying the template. You see it down here in the URL that it's our selection page. So it looks very much like a dashboard from Jira. And here you actually have the selection to go to the different IDPs that we have. So there's a lot of things you can do, and the selection, the IDP selection page, and also the error template that we give to users is something that's very often modified by our customers to really fit their needs. And there's some really, really cool examples out there on what they have done. One other customers, and we have the example in the knowledge base somewhere as well. He made our IDP selection page into multi-language. Yeah, so having different strings based on the browser settings. Another one turned it into a accept my terms and conditions page. Yeah, he doesn't even he only has one ID. He only has one identity provider, so he doesn't even need the IDP selection page. But what he does, he activated it and looks at if the cookie is not set. He shows people the terms and conditions, and then gives the accept terms and conditions. And that accept button redirects him to the identity provider, hence sets the cookie. So the next time the user gets to the IDP selection page, checks again for the cookie, it's already set, gets redirected straight away. So that's a let's call it a poor man's way to have to save your money on an accepting terms and conditions custom or plugin as well. So I've seen some really cool and funny uses of our page templates. So, but again, that is something that at least Atlassian definitely can't do out of the box, and where you have a lot less flexibility with it. So let me see how many chapters I jumped ahead. Here's the section about configure multiple IDPs. There are some examples down here as well, but I think I've showed you most of that already. Okay, yeah, let's talk about signing and encryption a little bit for a second. And actually, let me jump back to this to make it a little bit clearer. So you have 3 or 4 scenarios here. Yeah, the SAML request that's going to be put together in step 2 here, that can actually be signed, or it can be signed and encrypted. Yeah, so there's a signature way from 2, 3, 4. So basically from our plugin on the request to the identity provider. And then there's the same thing with the response. The SAML response can be signed, or it can be signed and encrypted. The SAML request can also be unsigned and unencrypted, by the way. Having an unsigned response doesn't really make sense, because you would never be able to trust that identity provider. So while that's theoretically possible, it wouldn't be secure. So having a signed SAML response is sort of the minimum that you need to support. Yeah, and that's actually what the Atlassian Data Center SAML does support. So it checks the signature of the SAML response. What the Atlassian plugin, what the Atlassian Data Center SAML doesn't support is signing the SAML request, so that the identity provider can make sure the request comes from a service provider or an application it actually recognizes and trusts. And also, Atlassian doesn't support any encryption, not in any of the directions, not from 2 to 4 and not from 5 to 7. So having the SAML request signed in step 2, so that the identity provider can verify it's from a trusted IDP, that's actually a fairly common request. So a lot of security divisions define that that's required and that's a minimum. So we get that request very often, and that's not supported by Atlassian SAML. So that's a relatively common request. A little bit less common is the requirement to have the SAML assertions encrypted. So let me try to put some percentages on it. Maybe 50% of our customers, definitely, maybe even a bit more, definitely want SAML requests to be signed, and maybe 10 or 5% of our customers also want them to be encrypted. So you could ask yourself, since a lot of this goes via HTTPS already, is it really necessary to also encrypt the SAML assertions? And the answer there is it depends. Yeah. Ultimately, it depends what's in that SAML assertion. A reverse proxy that does SSL offload would see the SAML response and the SAML request unencrypted, as well as the user browser. So if there's any information that the identity provider sends as part of the SAML response to our application that, for example, the user shouldn't see, yeah, role memberships or something like that, that the user shouldn't see, then you definitely need encryption. And the same is true if you want to be absolutely sure that throughout a man-in-the-middle attack, people cannot read what's exchanged in SAML insertion as responses, for example, group memberships, email addresses, and those kind of things that might get an attacker more attack vectors. Then encryption is also necessary. So the answer is it depends, and usually it's the more even more higher security customers who need that, the people who are in defense in some regulated industries, or people like the Googles of this world, etc., who are maybe a little bit more exposed to attacks than some other customers are, or more security minded, are the ones who also require the encryption of the SAML assertions. Also, you can replace our private key and the signing and encryption certificates. Usually in the SAML world, they are self-signed, but we do have some customers who have policies like they don't self-signed anywhere, so they also need to be able to replace the SAML certificates with ones that they generated, and you can do that in our plugin as well. So we support summary, we support signing in both directions, we support encryption in both directions, and we also we have the ability to replace a certificate or certificates that we use for that. Page templates. Like I said, we have everything that we show to the customer is a velocity template, so you can change it. Atlassian is a little bit more, even the error page is relatively unspecific and in my mind not very helpful. Ours you can customize, so most customers will put some information for users in there, who to contact, how to get help. Also quote the Authentication Tracker for this, so that the admin can actually look at the Authentication Tracker and identify the issue in there. So that's what you can easily do with our plugin. The other thing is you can import the configuration from our plugin via the UI, but even more, you can control our plugin completely via its API. So you can, for example, get the configuration out via the API as a JSON blob, do some changes, put it back in. And that's also heavily used by a lot of our customers who have Kubernetes infrastructures or clone their production instances into dev and test instances where they need to exchange some certificates or some settings to authenticate not against the production IDP, but against the test IDP, for example. So that helps and makes it a lot more easier than trying to extract and change that information from the database. Then there's also the authentication tracker side of things, or support in general. Let me jump into the product again. So I think this is something we're really damn proud of, to be honest. Troubleshooting is often something people don't quite think about it until they actually need it. And if it's then not quick enough, they really hate it. And the typical Atlassian way of troubleshooting, you know that, is turn on debugging, look at the Jira log file, replicate the problem, look at the Jira log file to go there. And that's not our approach. You can see here we have something that we call Authentication Trackers. And basically every authentication our plugin does gets put into a construct that we call Authentication Tracker. And by default, we keep that for 48 hours. Yeah. So for example, you see this authentication I did 17th of May. So that was yesterday, 2 o'clock. That was a logout. Here's a login for my test user. And I can now look at the details here. I see a lot of information, the user ID that got logged in, the status, debug messages around this, the the login information that we extracted from the SAML request, the SAML request ID that I could look in Okta to find their log entries, and a lot more. The update via the user sync connector and the results from that. The SAML request that we have sent, the SAML response that we got back, down to the HTTP headers and request information of the HTTP request. So there's tons and lots of information about the authentication, and you can do that, look at that in real time about a current authentication that you do by creating over here a new tracker, and then do your login and look at this. But also if a user calls you, I couldn't log in this morning, if you're lucky, he's still got the error page and the Authentication Tracker ID that the error page told him. If not, you can just filter it by whatever, user logged in or not logged in, etc. Hopefully you can find that user, look at the details, and you stand a really good chance to still figure out what went wrong here. Yeah. And even better, if you need our help, you can download the tracker, look at it as a JSON blob, or even more, you can just say contact support here, and this opens a ticket in our support system, including you can attach our support information and the tracker here. Yeah, so it doesn't really get much simpler than that, and that has a real purpose, because how many times do you have to deal with support where they ask you, so what Jira version are you on? What plugin version are you on? So the first couple of ping pongs are just to determine things. And then they might give you instructions, okay, enable this log, and then give me those log files. Ah, this wasn't enough. Enable this debug as well. And you have a lot of back and forth. And so, and soon you've wasted a day or two going back and forth. It's not that that never happens with us. Sometimes we need debugging or tracing as well, but it's a much rarer instance where that's actually the case. Most of the time, the authentication tracker together with support information is enough. Yeah, and here's also the download support information. That's a JSON blob which gives us about information about the full configuration of the SAML plugin and user sync if it's configured. But also a lot of a bit of the information around the instance. So what Jira version is it? What is it running on? Those kind of things. What other plugins are running that we can check for any clashes? So there's a lot of things that help us get you up and running very quickly again if there's any issue. Yeah, and like I said, this is an important thing because the deployment and the scenarios have changed over the last years, where it used to be a nice to have and people could fall back on their username and password. Nowadays, for a lot of the large and largest instances, single sign-on is the only way to authenticate. Yeah, and if that's not working, it's down. Right, so that actually leads me to the last thing here, which is giving a little bit of a heads up on user sync as well. We talked about user sync, synchronization, and I'm just going to give you a quick show around user sync as well, just to give you an idea. Let's go back into the instance. So if you've got our SAML plugin installed, then you have this user sync menu. If you're not using the SAML plugin, just a standalone app, then you just have the user sync part. And we have the concept of connectors. So every API that we implemented, like Azure One Login, Google Cloud Identity, etc., is actually implemented or can create a connector. And then the connector is essentially a connection to that remote system. And you can have multiple connectors to the same remote system. So you can have multiple connectors to, let's create an Azure one, for example. You could have multiple connectors going to Azure to a different tenant of Azure, for example. So if you have one Azure instance for your internal users, another Azure instance for contractors, we can synchronize both instances essentially. So, and the basic setup would be here on Azure, you need to create an application in the Azure portal. So you need the application ID, the tenant ID, and a secret. And after that, you can actually start synchronizing. But you also have a lot more configuration possibilities here, like you have on the SAML side. You can say that you only want to synchronize users in certain groups, and not all of your Azure users, but only the ones in, for example, Jira users on Azure. You can select which group types to sync. But there's also things like add a certain group to every user that's being synced, copy users from other directories on the first sync, so that helps a lot with migrations. And you have the attribute mapping UI here that you have in SAML as well. Just to mention it, this is a pre-release I'm showing you. So that's the one coming out next week. So that already has the new user sync UI. So if you look at your user sync in your instance right now, it will still look a little bit more dated and older from the UI, but the same principle, there's mapping. But with this mapping, we also will get things like being able to execute Groovy code on those mappings, support for Linchpin in about 6 weeks' time, the support for the Comunado plugin. So there's a lot that you can do, and there's a lot of things. So if I create a new attribute here, for example, manager, go to next, a single attribute from Azure AD, and here you see everything that we have access to via the Azure API. So there's an awful lot of data that we can start synchronizing into your Atlassian application if you need it there. Then also we have also on user sync a big amount of flexibility around group management. The default setup is we take the IDP as the single source of truth. So if a user is in 10 groups on the IDP, we make him a member of those 10 groups in Jira. If you assign a group locally, we throw him out again if that's not on the IDP. So the default setup is single source of truth for the IDP. But with those three options here, you can actually then control, no, treat those groups as local ones, or filter the ones from the IDP that you only assign those. So there's a lot of combinations you can do here. There's also a knowledge base article on some of those. But like I said at the very beginning, it's not that after this session, I want you to be the absolutely expert on user sync and our plugin and that stuff. I just want you to leave with a feeling, wow, there's a lot of flexibility. So that you know that most of the challenges that other plugins or the Atlassian solution doesn't solve out of the box, if you run into them, then you still have a bloody good chance that with the flexibility that we have, we can help you there. And hopefully you also discovered some value adds that make it worth paying for our plugin. Yeah. Ultimately, the initial opening question that I usually have is, why the hell should I pay for something that data center ships with out of the box? Yeah, summer. And I hope you've seen a lot of scenarios here where you can actually see, okay, this is in these scenarios, I can't even use data center SAML because I have those requirements, I have those provisioning requirements, those security requirements. That just doesn't work at all. But even if you come to the conclusion, okay, authentication with data center SAML would work, just in time would be enough for me as well. I still hope that you've heard a lot of additional things like the troubleshooting, being able to map more things into your instance, that you know, okay, yeah, that gives me enough additional benefit that I want to purchase that plugin, or that I want to keep this plugin when I migrate from maybe server to data center. After all, we're just a tiny fraction of the cost of your data center deployment after all, and I hope we can give you enough value that it's worth keeping us around. So I think that's it from this sheet. There isn't really, automatic user deactivation. Yes, I didn't talk about that, sorry. Basically, our SAML plugin comes with a basic thing. You see the screenshot here. When you use just-in-time provisioning, you do have this challenge of being able to deactivate users and free up licenses. Because if they don't log in, you never know about them not being able to log in anymore. So you can create a user sync connector to deactivate users, and you basically say, well, run once an hour, once a day, and deactivate user in the internal directory that haven't logged in for 30 days. So relatively simple and straightforward. If you need a lot more fine-grained capabilities around that, then look at our user deactivator plugin, which gives you a lot more fine-grained control of deactivating users. And that can also be combined with the Atlassian Data Center SAML if that's your choice, and you only need a solution for deactivating users. Or the other thing is, look at our standalone user sync application that solves all your provisioning challenges. If you feel Data Center SAML is enough to do the authentication, but you want to get your Azure users in, then just looking at our user sync app, which implements that provisioning, may be enough. But I also had the question at the beginning, and you might not have heard it because we were doing a little bit of a Q&A when we were waiting for the stream to start. We have a lot of customers that actually look at user sync initially to combine it with the Atlassian Data Center SAML, but ultimately a lot of them see the benefits of having that combined in a SAML app. So we don't have too much sales as the user sync standalone. We have a lot of evaluations that then actually, once people realize it comes with our SAML plugin, that they end up wanting to pay a little bit more, but having the combined solution from one vendor, one support, and there's some tiny benefits, well, not tiny, but there's some benefits when you have both combined. For example, our SAML plugin can initiate a user update whenever the user logs in, so that you always have the freshest information. So there's a little bit of additional benefits having that combined in the same app as well. Right, I hope I haven't put anyone to sleep yet after nearly an hour and a half of monologue. Björn, I'm not sure, do we have still any questions? Do we actually still have anyone watching the stream?
Yeah.
Good.
So the numbers say yes. Yeah, but one more question.
Okay,
from,
let me...
Matthew.
As a partner, we developed a custom app for customer to sync users. It's a pain, it's a pain to maintain. Can user sync help there? The short answer is yes.
Thanks.
No, I can give you a longer answer, don't worry. We in the past we had the capability, and we actually still have. We had the capability to develop custom connectors. So we have on Bitbucket we have a connector template where you can develop your custom connector, and that's fundamentally still possible. And we have, for example, our reference customer, University of Vienna. They have a custom connector to connect to their student management system via REST and synchronize student data in there for use and their GR service management. So a custom connector like that would probably probably be a replacement, would have been a replacement in the past for your custom app. And there the benefit is you only need to implement the logic to connect to the customer system. Yeah, you don't need to implement all the logic that user sync takes care of, like synchronizing users, the interface to the Atlassian user API, which can be different from product to product, which changes so that on app updates to do that. So you could have it took a lot of the pain away that you describe by you not having to keep up with the Atlassian applications, us providing a relatively stable API, and you only, I think that the connector for University of Vienna was like 400 or 500 lines to implement the logic to connect to those remote systems, and that's it. But in the version which we're shipping next week, that gets even simpler to a degree. In terms of that, we have the ability to completely write a connector in Groovy. Yeah, I told you about our Groovy fan developer. So you can now create a custom connector and put Groovy code in there. So you essentially need to then write a couple of Groovy functions to implement the connection to that remote system. Is that going to be enough for your customer? That's where you need to reach out to us in terms of talk to us. It depends if that requirement can be filled with the default packages that we include in the Groovy connector, then the answer is probably yes. If it's not, then a custom connector, or we just need to add some more packages. And a lot of our development is based on customer feature requests. So to give you a 100% answer, if the Groovy connector would be the even simpler and working solution for you, we would need to understand a little bit more. So maybe contact me afterwards or give our support a shout, and we can look that up. More? I think this is the second presentation in my life that I finish on time.
We planned 60 minutes.
Yeah, but you've known for a long while that that's going to be an hour and a half.
But it was my bet in the comments, and you need 30 minutes more.
Okay, well then. Okay, if we do this as a webinar, it's 1.5 hours, and that's where I manage on time. So, all right, guys, have a great day. Thanks for spending the time with me here. Leave us some comments how you liked it. And also, if there's any critical feedback, then please give it to us. Ultimately, you're spending a lot of your time to understand our products better. So if you can help me deliver that in a better way, or in the right way that you get the most out of it, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.